Jack Fincher was a magazine writer by trade. As he approached 60, he decided to retire from that work and find a new challenge. So his son David, who was at the time a blossoming director of TV commercials and music videos, suggested that Jack try his hand at writing a screenplay. Jack had always been very fond of the movie Citizen Kane and screenwriter Herman Mankiewicz, so that's where he aimed his focus. About 30 years later, we finally have the movie Mank, written by the late Jack Fincher and directed by his son David. Mank plays out in two parallel stories. The first takes place in 1940 with acerbic drunken screenwriter Herman Mankiewicz, played by Gary Oldman, holed up in a bungalow in Victorville, California while he recovers from a broken leg and dictates his latest screenplay to his secretary Rita, played by Lily Collins. The screenplay is initially titled The American and is an ambitious, non-linear story about the life of a rich newspaper tycoon turned failed politician. The other storyline is told in flashbacks, as we see Mank's misadventures and relationships over the past decade that served as real-life inspiration for this screenplay. Mankiewicz's screenplay has been commissioned by Orson Welles, the wonderkind who's already conquered the worlds of theater and radio and is making his first foray into pictures with an unprecedented blank check from RKO. Welles is conspicuously absent from the writing process in Victorville, but his longtime producer John Houseman is frequently checking in, and Rita the secretary is there to babysit Mank and keep him away from the bottle as much as she's there to take dictation. As she's taking dictation, it's Rita who first notes some striking similarities between the characters in Mank's script and some real-life figures. Cut to 10 years earlier in 1930. Mank is a smooth-talking but not particularly hard-working screenwriter for MGM, coasting on his considerable wit but focusing more on gambling and drinking. He wakes up from a bender in a place he doesn't recognize and finds himself on a film set, basically, where he runs into actress Marion Davies, played by Amanda Seyfried. Mank and Davies hit it off immediately, and she introduces him to her lover and benefactor, the newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst, played by Charles Dance. And the two parallel stories play out from there. Mank stays in the Hearst orbit throughout the 1930s and associates with others in the Hearst orbit, including Marion Davies, but also Irving Thalberg and Louis B. Mayer, who together ran MGM. And in the 1940 storyline, Mank struggles with his deadline and his sobriety, and has to fend off a series of visitors who come to Victorville trying to convince him to not move forward with the screenplay he's writing, lest it anger some pretty powerful people. Many of you probably know the epilogue of this story. The finished product, Citizen Kane, retitled from The American, was controversial upon release in 1941 because of the clear proximity of the Charles Foster Kane character to William Randolph Hearst, and Hearst forbade any advertisements, reviews, or even mention of the movie in any of the many newspapers he owned at the time. I really enjoy the way Mank is written. I think it's smart and funny, mostly because Mank himself is very smart and very funny.
Mank! Are you okay?
No, that almost killed me.
But I really dig the way the movie's structured. Citizen Kane itself very famously opens with the death of Charles Foster Kane as he utters the word Rosebud, and the movie is structured around a reporter in the present day interviewing figures from Kane's past to try to get a sense of the man. And with each interview, it flashes back to meaningful moments from Kane's life until eventually we do get a sense of the man. It is not at all lost on me that Mank is similarly structured using a present-day narrative spine, but with the meat of the story shown in frequent flashbacks to provide color and context. I don't know, maybe I'm easy to impress, but I think that's clever, and I enjoy that. And that's to say nothing of the execution of the structure. When you have a movie with parallel storylines like this, whether it's The Godfather Part 2, or Gerwig's Little Women, or Julie and Julia, the real trick is knowing when and how to organically move between the storylines, and Mank's really good at that. And it took me a couple viewings to really appreciate how good it is, because often a name will be mentioned in 1940, the movie will flash back, but then it'll take its sweet time to get to the person whose mention inspired the flashback. And I think a lesser script wouldn't have the confidence to try to pull that off. So ultimately, Mank feels cohesive, but not in a way that feels obvious. If you watch more of these, you'll notice that's not the first time I've said that something took me a couple viewings to appreciate. I'd like to think that 2020 may have exacerbated this problem because I was watching all of these movies at home in less than ideal conditions, meaning not in the theater. But realistically, I think it's more that I can't keep two things in my head at once, and I need one viewing to take it all in, get my head around the story, but I need that second viewing if I want to assess it or analyze it in any meaningful way. That said, I think Mank in particular was tough for me to make heads or tails of after just one viewing, and not because the story is particularly complex or hard to follow, but because it really wasn't what I was expecting, in two significant ways. The first is in regard to disputed authorship. Pauline Kael, who was the renowned longtime critic for The New Yorker, famously wrote a book-length essay in 1971 called Raising Kane, in which she argued that although Citizen Kane is credited as being co-written by Herman J. Mankiewicz and Orson Welles, Mank actually wrote the movie and Welles did next to nothing. I'm far from an expert on the topic, but apparently Raising Kane as an investigative piece has largely been debunked, or at least itself disputed by various people. However, this Citizen Kane authorship controversy did not begin with Pauline Kael. It had been around since the movie came out, she just revived it. And debunked or not, Raising Kane's damage had been done. Mostly because of people like me who haven't actually read Raising Kane or any of the many rebuttals, but have at least heard of it. So while I may not know the nuances of Kael's argument or the apparent flaws therein, I do know that the authorship of Citizen Kane's screenplay is or was controversial. So when I hear that David Fincher is making a movie for Netflix about one of the screenwriters of Citizen Kane, the one who wasn't Orson Welles, my immediate expectation is that this will be a movie about the authorship controversy. And it's not. That's a minor plot point, but that's not what this movie is. Maybe it almost was, though. Jack Fincher was a fan of Pauline Kael, and his first draft of this script was reportedly an adaptation of Raising Kane, basically. But David Fincher thought Jack should rework it to be more about the man, Mank. During the press tour for Mank, David Fincher told the New York Times, "It was not my interest to make a movie about a posthumous credit arbitration. I was interested in making a movie about a man who agreed not to take any credit and who then changed his mind. That was interesting to me." The second expectation that may have muddled my first watch of Mank is Fincher's entire filmography, basically. I've seen 9 movies and 2 TV shows that he's directed, which is a significant body of work, and I think all of them to varying degrees explore the darker depths of humanity, or at the very, very least are cynical or pessimistic to varying degrees. Even his movie that people flag as like the crowd-pleasing Oscar bait movie is actually pretty cynical about the impossibility of lasting relationships and the fleeting nature of compatibility and the creeping inevitability of dying alone. I'm rambling, but my point is that I expected Mank to be similarly cynical or barbed or dark. This is Fincher after all. And in the first few minutes, it does feel like the movie is setting up Mank for a fall from grace. We see that he has a loving wife named Sarah, played by Tom Middleton. We see that he's got a cushy job for the studios that he doesn't take seriously. And we see that he drinks way too much and has plenty of vices. Basically, he's got a lot to lose. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop to see him mess it all up. When's he gonna make a pass at Rita or at Marion Davies? When's his drinking gonna cost him his job or his wife? And those things don't happen. I kept waiting for Mank to reveal himself to be a bad dude, again, Fincher movie, but he's actually pretty decent despite all his vices. Rather than a fall from grace, Mank's arc in the movie is actually an ascension. His writing of Citizen Kane, taking direct shots at William Randolph Hearst and those in his orbit, was fairly courageous and transgressive and speaking truth to power, and he was risking his reputation and career to do it. And effectively, the whole movie is an exploration of why he would take that risk. And the short answer, without spoiling anything, is that he finds his principles. One of the best scenes early on is when Mank and his team of writers have to go to David O. Selznick and pitch him on the movie that they've ostensibly been working on for weeks. And they very clearly pitch him a movie off the top of their heads. That shows you how much Mank cares about anything. That is the starting point for Mank's principles when it comes to his writing, which is little more than a means to a drink. But throughout the movie, shown in flashbacks, he encounters things that he cannot abide, things he finds to be legitimately wrong. So he uses what powers he has, his wit and his pen, to fight those wrongs. Much like Mank's narrative structure is mimicking Citizen Kane's, This central arc is sort of the opposite of Citizen Kane. Charles Foster Kane begins the movie as a young idealist, boldly printing a literal declaration of principles on the front page of his newspaper when he first enters the media world. But it doesn't take long before he's an old, cynical man who abandons his principles and uses his paper to manipulate public opinion to his will. Where Citizen Kane is about abandoning principles and using the power of the written word for ill, Mank is about finding principles and using that power for good. So, most modern movies that take place during the golden age of the studio system are love letters to Hollywood. And especially given that pitch I just gave that Mank is a writer taking on the system, you might think that this movie is also a love letter to Hollywood and to those that make movies. And I think it's actually the opposite. The system that Mank takes on, the studios are very much a part of it. Arliss Howard, Sergeant Cowboy himself, plays famed Golden Age studio head Louis B. Mayer, one of the namesakes of MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And he's one of the main antagonists in this movie. He's portrayed as a duplicitous, back-dealing manipulator, both in how he treats his employees at the studio and in regard to how he wields the considerable power his studio has in shaping public opinion. Side note, it's interesting to think about this movie in relation to the Oscars, particularly because Louis B. Mayer founded the Oscars as a union-busting tactic. Studio employees were beginning to organize in the 20s, and Mayer thought that if he could distract them with shiny gold statues, they'd be too busy competing with each other that they wouldn't join forces and collectively fight the studios. Valiant effort, Mr. Mayer. That said, as much as the movie makes a point to show the golden age of Hollywood with the opposite of rose-colored glasses, it's still a joy to see old Hollywood on screen, particularly in a David Fincher movie with his obsessive attention to detail. My wife's a big fan of old Hollywood, so she really liked that this movie has David O. Selznick and Marion Davies and Irving Thalberg, even if not all of them are shown to be particularly good people. For me, I think it's fascinating to get a glimpse at how the movie-making ecosystem worked 90 years ago. That's really interesting to me. But I know a lot of people are put off by movies about movies and Hollywood patting itself on the back, but this really isn't that. What bite the movie has, it's biting towards the studios and the media and those that sway public opinion for nefarious purposes. But, as I kind of alluded earlier, Mank doesn't have quite as much bite as other Fincher work, which is a high bar. It may not have the staying power of some of his other movies, or may not be as haunting as some of his other movies, high bars on both accounts, but I still really enjoyed this. The older I get, the more I become a sucker for good craft, and Fincher is one of the most talented formalist directors working today, while still making super entertaining movies. Even if Mank is not my favorite movie of his, he makes so few movies that I really do cherish each one. Often a name will be mentioned